Today I'm joined by my good friends Tinker Tinking and Dylan O'Sullivan to talk about a great book called White Mirror. But before we dive in, I'd just love if you guys could give me a brief intro, just so everybody knows who you are and how you became associated with this book.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. The way that White Mirror started was that I was already writing stories that would become White Mirror before I saw a writing contest on Twitter from Jim O'Shaughnessy. And a friend, Sam McRoberts, sent it to me. It was like, hey, I think a lot of your stories would shine here. So I responded. They were just looking for like a tweet-sized description of a story, like an idea for one, specifically counterposed to Black Mirror. So something that's positive and technologically oriented, future-oriented. So, I responded. I was like, well, can I, instead of just writing a tweet summary of an idea, can I respond with a full story? And the response was sure. So I was like, can I respond with more than one story? And I said, sure. So I responded with 9 short stories. And then
so
later...
from a single tweet to 9 full short stories.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
that
actually,
works.
He's very verbose.
Well, I want to make sure the point gets across. And then later that day, I had an idea for another story. So I actually wrote that one up on the same day and then tagged on a 10th story. And that's the one that eventually won. And then I went on Jim's podcast, Infinite Loops. We had a great time. And then about a month later, I was thinking about it. I was like, you know what? I'm going to keep writing in this vein of White Mirror stories because, these were part of a larger sort of collection of short stories that I dubbed the Lucilius Parables and had published 2 volumes of that. I was like, I'll just keep writing these White Mirror stories until I have a themed collection and then I'll publish that. And so I, mocked up a bad cover for it and just posted that on Twitter. And within like a quarter second, Jim responded and he was like, I'll publish it, which came as a surprise because he didn't have Infinite Books at the time. He hadn't announced anything with regards to his new company. So I was like, you're going to publish it? Like, okay. Like, I'm not sure what that means. Then he told me, he's like, I'm going to start a publisher, etc. I was like, interesting. And then I just started writing furiously. I was pumping out like 2 or 3 stories a week for a number of weeks, at least about a month or 2. I was just writing a lot in terms of these White Mirror stories. And 31 made it into the book. And I think there were about like 55 or 56 that we sort of culled from. I say we because, shortly after this, I was like, I'm going to need help getting this book into shape. And I noticed that Dylan was, at the time, he was an intern for Jim's brand new company. And, I checked out his stuff and I was like, all right, this guy knows his shit. And so I DM'd him. I was like, hey, I noticed that you're an intern at the company of the guy who said that he'd publish my book. And I was wondering if like maybe you could help me out in terms of, editing it, putting another pair of eyes on it and helping me get it into publishable shape. So that's how I met Dylan.
Perfect segue. Dylan, tell us about yourself a little bit. And from your point of view, how did White Mirror come into your life?
Rapidly. Life was moving very fast at that point. I was kind of at a crossroads. So I just finished a master's degree and I was about to do a PhD. And then I saw this rogue tweet that a guy called Jim, I didn't know who he was sponsoring scholarships to a thing called Rite of Passage. So I said, I really, really, really don't want to do a PhD, but it seems like the only thing that I can actually feed myself on. So then I applied to that and got it and did that. It was just basically a writing course for a couple of months. And then afterwards, I just emailed. I think Jim likes cold emails. Like when you can kind of go to him directly, I think he appreciates it. So I said, look, if you ever need a second pair of hands in anything, I'm trying not to do a PhD, but I may end up doing it. Just let me know. And then he said, well, I'm starting a company in like 2 months. Do you want to come on as an intern? So I said, yes. Wasn't sure what my speciality would be. Like my stuff had always been writing and editing focused. And again, Infinite Books wasn't even a name yet. Initially, OSP didn't have a publishing arm at all. Like it kind of grew gradually alongside White Mirror, really. It was probably the inciting thing. And then, yeah, I got a DM from a weird Anon on Twitter. And I again,
as you do.
OSP is very async, so I was learning about White Mirror and that, Jim said he's published it and he's my boss, so I guess I can start working on this and that's part of my job now. And then,
surprise.
Yeah, and then we started chatting first of all, and then we just started hopping on Zooms, and then, yeah, it all just kind of took flight from there. Early 2023, I think, was when it all kind of started to swell.
Yeah, like April or May, somewhere around there, I think. By the time the summer rolled around, we were pretty in the thick of it, I think.
We were knee deep.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And just a little bit of extra context for the listener who hasn't read it yet, but White Mirror is a collection of 31 interconnected sci-fi stories following Lucius among like various futures. And from my point of view, he's a bit of a Renaissance man, an inventor, an explorer, kind of like Indiana Jones of the future in many ways. I also want to make clear I'm very biased because like White Mirror is published by OSV's Infinite Books, as they mentioned. I was on many of the calls about the book, about the design of the book. I was on some of the calls between Dylan and Tinker Thinking about the writing of the book, and all that was amazing. But I love it. That was part of my reason for wanting to be part of publishing it. I don't love it because I published it. I think that order matters a lot. So be warned, I'm very biased. I love it, but it's because it's great. Question for you guys. Talk to me about the positioning of the book as more optimistic, hopeful sci-fi, because the whole genre right now is very dominated by dystopian views, very dark views. Like, what inspired this optimistic view? Was it purely because of the tweet by Jim about like, oh, we need a white mirror to kind of counter Black Mirror? Or was this always something you were thinking of?
No, I mean, as I mentioned, I'd already been writing stories in this genre without explicitly calling it White Mirror by the time he'd posted that. I think I was just kind of exhausted of... I love sci-fi movies, and I remember one day coming to the realization that like none of them are positive. I mean, I guess Arrival is maybe the most positive sci-fi movie that I can think of off the top of my head, but even it is just like filled with the whole, like a big part of the point of the story is that there's so much unnecessary drama in this coordination problem among humans. You know, I think it has like a good and positive and uplifting ending, but it's a rare sci-fi story, at least in the modern age. If you go back far enough, you lapse back up into the optimistic sci-fi. But yeah, I think it was just being exhausted with it, especially since there's so many cool things that are popping up now, and technological progress to some extent does seem to be, you know, speeding up, and new and novel toys and tools are popping up, which are a lot of people are freaking out about, but it's also just expands your ability, your agency, your sense of wonder if you're not a complete doomer. But yeah, I think it's just general exhaustion with pessimism.
Question for both of you about sci-fi. Like, I'm curious if you are fans of it. Do you read sci-fi? Is this something you know well, or do you maybe approach it from a different angle, more of as an outsider? Kind of curious about your influences. Any like favorite authors or like pieces of writing that you find inspiring, or like what do you aspire to as writers and editors? I'm kind of curious about that background, because from my point of view, White Mirror is very different from any sci-fi I read right now, and I kind of get the feeling that it's because it's not coming from the same place as most of it. So I'm curious, like, what's that place for both of you?
Yeah, I have an embarrassingly simple answer. So I'm really curious what Dylan will say to this.
Oh, I thought you were going to lead into your incredibly embarrassing answer.
No. Like, I'm genuinely curious, because you're more of like the classic literature. You're focused on classic literature as opposed to sci-fi.
Yeah, I don't love it. I don't read it. I find it, again, there are merits to sci-fi that novels that I love have in common. Again, I kind of see it as the backdrop, and the stage itself, without a compelling story and astonishing explorations of human nature, is just inanimate. And I find it can be a very interesting background, and it can give you a lot of leeway with respect to plot and technology and things like that. But for me, I'm always story first. So we're both coming from a similar place at the very least. I love Borges, and this kind of like mind-bending, stepping over the frontiers of the imagination type of fiction is what I love. And sci-fi lends itself to that, but to make it sci-fi and to make it fit within a canon and to follow convention wasn't the end goal, I don't think, for either of us. It was more a stage from which then we could really bend fiction and anthologies and a discontinuous continuity with respect to how the chapters spoke to each other. So it was more a vehicle for, I think, us, but definitely me.
I have a similar answer. I've read an embarrassingly small amount of sci-fi. I've heard great things about Ian Banks' The Culture series, and apparently I picked the wrong one to try and get into it. I picked the very first one because I thought that's where you should start. And no shade against Banks. Like, he's a brilliant visionary, but there was just too much of the sort of Marvel variety of action that was going on that, for me, I get very bored with Marvel movies and all that sort of stuff. So, there's just like so much running around and shooting and, okay, now the ship is crashing into this thing. And it's very like epic sort of scenery. But again, as like Dylan touched on, it was like a bit superficial. I loved some of the concepts around the culture in the Culture series, but it almost just didn't get into that fast enough and was relying too much on this flash bang scenery that is afforded by Sci-Fi. Other than that, like, I've read something that had a huge influence on me, and I didn't even realize it because I'd read it so long ago. I didn't realize it until after White Mirror was finished, but I read Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man, and I remember just absolutely loving that book. But that was many years ago. I could only tell you like one story that's actually in it and vaguely what the premise was. Then I've read Asimov's Foundation series. I mean, I guess you could say 1984 is Sci-Fi, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. But other than that, I embarrassingly just haven't read much sci-fi at all. I wouldn't call myself a sci-fi nerd, which is a little weird considering we're talking about a book of sci-fi that I wrote. But yeah, I was very much like Dylan. I loved story forward novels and movies, and I studied literature when I was in university. So none of that touched on sci-fi. Oh, I guess Cormac McCarthy's The Road would qualify as sci-fi, and I love that novel. It's more like takes place in the future. It's not really. There's no real like technological enhancements, but I think that
it's not exactly optimistic.
Yeah, well, it depends how much you weight the last like page and a half or something like that.
True.
It's pretty grim, but it's beautifully, beautifully written. And I also, it's like my favorite kind of story where it's very like plodding and meandering and methodical or meditative, and not really too much happens. It's just a focus on like the moments that these characters are experiencing. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to sci-fi, I've been a huge fan of sci-fi movies as opposed to books. So as a medium or like a realm genre, it's spoken to me more through like the visual sense. And then it was kind of accidental that I started writing sci-fi because I think I mentioned that this larger Lucilius Parables effort and the two prior volumes of short stories that I published really as a writing exercise was like, all right, well, I want to write short stories. And I had to lay down some rules in order to just be productive, because I'd had a previous life of writing more serious classical short stories and then kind of tried to give up writing, and that didn't go too well. So I just kept writing. And but I had a big switch, and I limited how much I was allowed to write. And I was like, all right, you get 20 minutes in the morning, and that's it. You got to bust out something in 20 minutes. And that's how tinkerthinking.com and the blog evolved. And so then I started tacking on short stories, and I was like, all right, same character, episodic. He can exist in sort of any realm or universe that I need him to be in, and at any age and at any time in history. That premise naturally just extended the timeline into the future. So Lucilius Parables volumes, he's in present day, he's in the past, he kind of jumps all over the place. And then all of the future ones just started to sort of like organically emerge as White Mirror-esque stories, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I truly feel it while reading it, that this is sci-fi, but it's not coming from, I'm reading a ton of sci-fi and I'm going to kind of imitate, right? It's more like almost a first principle sci-fi. It's like, I want to explore these concepts about like the human condition and what is memory, who are you, like all these deeper questions, almost mystical at times. It goes from like hard sci-fi to kind of more mystical or philosophical at times. It feels like the sci-fi is the backdrop, right? The world building exists to do these more character-based things rather than, I have a cool concept about spaceships and like, dolphins in space or whatever, and I'm gonna create characters to serve my high concept ideas or whatever. It does feel like also old school in some ways. I grew up reading the old stuff, Asimov and all that, and it was very inspiring. It was like, I can't wait for the future. It's going to be amazing. There's some of that in there, but that didn't have the good characters, right? So it's kind of a mix of good literary fiction and some of the older school sci-fi, which I find very unique right now. Like I'm not finding elsewhere. Another thing I love is like you started talking about the rules you made for Lucilius. That was part of my question is how do you see him as a character? And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the reader needs to figure that out for himself. But do you see him as like literally the same person? Or do you see him as kind of like, it's almost like a multiverse? There are different versions of him in all these stories. Or even as an editor, Dylan, like how do you approach editing such a varied character in many ways? Almost non-linear, right? He's almost like a Schrodinger's character.
I appreciate the compliment about him a little earlier, but I'm actually going to push it back against it and say that he's actually a little bit flat, and he kind of needs to be just because he's in so many different circumstances. As a writer, you try to evoke as much character as you can in a given situation, even if that's the case. Because I think there's sort of two ways to go about trying to write a short story. One is where a character is in your mind and you watch them closely enough so that they become so real, and then you just write down what you see. And with enough practice, I think that can become a great story. And then the other sort of method or experience for writing a story that I've found is that you have like a kernel of an idea that's more conceptual, and then you need a character to populate it. And that's very much how the Lucilius Parables sort of started. It was always as a big switch from like my prior writing in life. This was way more like, oh, I've got an idea for a story. And that's why I called them parables. It kind of like let me off the hook in terms of, a parable is a simple story. And there's usually, if you're reading a parable, you're not expecting like this intense character development and driven story. It's sort of like, oh, there's purposely some kind of moral or point or concept that's trying to be pushed towards me. So in that way, like parables or moral stories are very similar to your description of sci-fi, where they have a concept or a particular ship that they're trying to push, and then they, characters are sort of incidental. And so admittedly, that was how I felt about this set of stories. And then I think by the time White Mirror rolled around, I think Lucilius definitely has like a bit of there's definitely a lot there, despite being a little bit more flat than you'd expect from some sort of dramatic story, because he's very, he's very calm, he's very patient, usually he's very curious, he's very childlike in all of these ways. I don't think he ever gets like frustrated or upset or pissed off or anything. He's very kind of accepting of what happens, and then has this exploratory.
Yeah, maybe there's a bit of Sherlock Holmes in him, right? Even when there are problems that are difficult, he's like, he finds that exciting, he finds that positive. Like the chase is the thing that he loves.
Yeah. And like I said, it evolved from like a set of parables, which were sort of like mildly intended to be like, hey, do we all have to be so like hopped up on our negativity and our negative emotions? Can we like, is there something a little bit better that we could just like try to emulate or strive for a little bit? So I think I was writing those parables sort of for me, because I was trying to give myself an example that I could sort of follow in my own life, sort of write yourself into a different person. That was certainly like one of the cornerstones of why I started Tinkered Thinking in the first place. And then I ended up writing like 1,000 unedited essays and a bunch of short stories. So I was like, all right, what would I like to see? Like what would I like to have written, becomes the whole point, I guess. I've kind of gone off on a tangent, but Dylan, what would you think about Lucilius?
To edit, or about him as a person?
Both. I'm curious how it's very possible for you to think about him as a character very differently from the author, because that's the thing with characters, right? Like nobody owns them fully. Your version of Lucilius could be different, and that can still work.
Well, yeah, to edit is a bloody nightmare. I still haven't fully recovered.
Sorry.
It almost drove me to drink. Yeah. I lost my house, my kids. But no, so a couple things. In some ways it was difficult to edit, and then in some ways it was very easy. Because it's an anthology, if it was a straight anthology, it would have been totally easy, because, each story has its own internal logic and architecture, often style, like, there's a handwritten story in there that's kind of like completely different in tone and syntax to everything else. So when you can just like you isolate things down and treat it in a modular way, it's very easy. Now, I'm sure Tinkered will get into chiasmus and various things very, very shortly. I'm surprised he hasn't already.
Get to that.
But when we did try and think of having a holistic element to it also, then we kind of were trying to retrofit that a little bit. So kind of made the stories work, and then we're like, okay, then now that they're working, how can we tweak them so we get this kind of greater than the sum of its parts when a reader finishes the book. Lucida's is pretty flat, but it's also mysterious. I think especially in short stories, like white space is everything, because you can only give a little vignette. It's what you don't say and what you don't write, because you're literally confined to a short story. So you have to really let subtext and that kind of thing communicate to the reader. Also, we couldn't develop him because the stories are going back and forward through time, and that kind of idea of like parallel worlds and interlacing timelines and stuff was kind of central. So it'd be weird if he just aged, if you had a coming of age line to cut through the middle, I think that would actually take away. So the fact that it's scattered, and then he's kind of this Forrest Gump of the future, kind of thrust into various settings, I thought that really ended up kind of being interesting, that the reader can read into him. Like, he's a kind of a relatively man of few words. We don't know where he's learned all these tricks and where he's gotten his expertise, where he went to college to be an expert in molecular biology and physics, and so it's kind of cool. It's almost like a throwback to he's almost like an action hero who can do everything, but it's not action oriented, it's more cerebral, which I think fits into Tinkered's persona.
Another thing that jumped out at me is that many stories explore AI, sentience, neural interfaces, even the importance of language and how it can limit or expand our thinking. Like, since you wrote this, the world has moved in the direction of White Mirror a fair amount. Just in the past couple of years, went from like, hey, this ChatGPT thing is kind of cool, to people are spending all day chatting with AIs, and AIs can basically pass the Turing test. People are talking to AIs in voice mode. Like, we're getting closer to the Octobots by the day. I'm curious how you think about that. Anything that at the time seemed like, far in the future, far-fetched visions that feel almost like today's reality, right? If you were writing White Mirror today, how much further on the horizon would you need to go to do things that seem as out there? Like, basically, do you feel like reality is catching up with some of the visions in there?
Yeah, I mean, since I've written it, there's at least one story I can think of off the top of my head that has sort of come true, which I'd say is the third story. At least it hasn't come true. It's that it's entirely technically possible to pull off. So if anyone needs like a really good startup idea, like, please buy White Mirror and read at least up to the third story. It's basically like, if think about, all right, this is going to get in like the surveillance state a little bit. If your phone is always listening to you and you have a fight with your spouse or your girlfriend or whatever, and their phone is also always listening to what's going on, you could ingest all of a fight plus all of the context of everything that's been said since whatever program has started listening. Then you could essentially take an LLM, AI, whatever you want to call it, that has infinite patience and ideally a huge context, and it would be able to say, basically prompt the humans in ways that could help them move through that fight or whatever they're bickering about in order to come back together and make more progress and just be happier. Whereas like a therapist today is like an extremely limited context, because the therapist isn't there during the fight. They only hear about the fight after the fact or whatever the issue is. And by that point, it's already become a memory. And then it becomes a reinterpretation of that memory as it's told to the therapist. Like, it's like a game of telephone that's like highly corrupted by bias, where of course everyone's the hero of their own story. So they're going to say things in a way that's framed so that it's quite charitable to themselves. It's an extremely rare person who's going to go to a therapist and be like, yeah, I was a horrible person, and here are all the exact reasons why, and be perfectly correct about that without being like purposely self-deprecating in a very unproductive, unhealthy way. If someone has that much self-awareness and clarity about what's going on, they probably don't need to go to a therapist, and they're probably not going to have the fight in the first place. So a system could be developed that would basically be a great mitigator between, a couple in that case. So that's one story that's definitely technically possible today and could potentially be great, because at the end of the story, actually, just remembering this, it extends to other fields where this could help, like
world peace, right?
Yeah, relations between countries, because there you don't just have like fights which involve the deaths of soldiers and your populace, but you almost always have a language barrier on top of it, which just makes the coordination problem just like that much more difficult. Whereas like AI is brilliant when it comes to translations.
Even culture, right? Few people have the full context of both or multiple cultures involved in these conflicts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's one story that's definitely come true. And I knew that was going to be coming true soon, which is why it's like earlier in the collection. Not perfectly, but they're sort of like roughly correlated with, things that are less probable and probably more in the future are later in the collection, and things that are maybe more likely are earlier in the collection. That's not like a hard rule. There's clearly gaping exceptions to that.
Yeah, considering how chatbots are, like the reported top uses is like basically a therapist. Like even without the kind of constant surveillance, just having two people using chatbots as therapists, if there was a way for information to be shared between these chats while preserving privacy, but then both sides would have full context to give even better advice, right? That would be like the 0.1 version of that, that kind of bootstrap that.
Yeah.
Another story that I think is very close to being true, like without spoiling the whole thing, but a lot of it is unspoilable because it's not plot based, but there's one called Old Fashioned where people are using basically AI as kind of like dating wingman or whatever to help them on a date. And like with an AirPod and a real-time AI, that would be possible right now, I think.
Yeah, I was at the gym the other day, and in the sauna, there was a very loquacious older fellow talking to me. And he was telling me about, he's just starting to date again. And he's like, God, like, women are like in their mid 30s or younger, like they won't go out on a date with you without having done like an NSA level amount of research online, like figuring out exactly who you are, who you've been, and like what's going on with you. And, being an older dude, that kind of shocked him and horrified him simultaneously. So I'm sure if he read that story, he would see it as a Black Mirror story.
Well, people may not say that that's what they're doing, but how many text messages on Tinder, on WhatsApp, whatever, are actually written by AI or co-written by AI? People are already dating through AI right now. That may be more Black Mirror than White Mirror, but it's happening.
Yeah, I saw a video, and it was a girl recording herself texting a guy, and in real time she had like professional savant level expertise about soccer. So she was giving him all this insight into his favorite team. She didn't have a clue, but she was just getting fed answers, and he was like, "I think I'm in love." Like you could see it on his face because he's like, "She's beautiful," and she like is like an expert on my favorite team. And like, I don't know, I think it was more of a bit than anything, but I fear that's where we're headed.
That's kind of like cultural makeup a little bit.
Epistemic makeup.
Yeah. Like, a woman puts on makeup and often she looks dramatically different than if she wasn't wearing makeup. Like, it's very similar to be like, oh, well, normally I don't know shit all about soccer, but with this new fancy GPT makeup, suddenly I'm an expert in it. In that sense, a mask is actually aspirational in a lazy way. It's like, oh, I wish I looked this way. Because, how much more convenient would it be just to like look like the makeup that you put on instead of having to fucking put on the makeup all the time? And also, wouldn't it be nice if I just knew everything about soccer without actually having to have had an interest in it? So
where it gets really dystopian is when one side is pretending to know about something and the other side is also pretending to be interested in that thing. And so it's basically two AIs exchanging about a topic that the two people actually don't care about.
Human rapper, yeah.
Performative interaction.
Another theme that comes up often is simulation, right? A simulated reality or various layers of simulation, one inside the other. What fascinates you about all this, about what is reality? What is base reality? Does it even exist? What is simulation or all that type of stuff? I'm curious, where does that come from? Is it just like a convenient device to write stories, or is it something that you're thinking a lot about?
Dylan, do you have a response to that one?
I don't think about the simulation very often. No. It's kind of, I saw someone say like, okay, presume everything's a simulation. Like, what would you do differently? You know, I'm already trying. I was like, well, I felt like, you know, why am I playing the simulation where I'm rich? Like, why? I'm giving it my best, you know? So it's like, you know, and then who's in control? It is, when you start peeling back the layers, by all accounts, there's some prominent people who entertain it, but it's not anything, doesn't keep me up at night.
I remember going through a rough patch in life, and I decided to make a dedicated effort to get into meditation. I remember I was a few months into it. I was like walking to the grocery store, and I wasn't feeling particularly well. It was like a shit rainy day, and I remember having this thought of like, well, what if this was a video game and I was just like in a level, and the level is like going to the grocery store and coming back, and the whole point of the level
Worst
is
video
like,
game ever.
or no, like actually, yeah, that's the default assumption. But like, you know, what if the point of the game is like, how much can I like actually enjoy this necessary experience, and you know, how much can I just like be present and notice it? I'm perhaps elaborating a bit charitably on my own thoughts at the moment, but I remember like having that thought, looking around and be like, damn, the graphics are really, really good. And that just like cheered me up. And I just remember, you know, going to the Whole Foods or whatever, and just paying a lot of attention. And it was a way to like get me out of my own head. And so, you know, as I delved more into meditation, this idea of like a simulation becomes very helpful when, you know, practices of Vipassana, where you're trying to like look back on your own mind or view the mind from within itself in order to train yourself an ability that one of the effects is that when you get like really angry, or some reason to get angry like really spikes everything in your system, instead of getting like totally intoxicated in that and getting swept away and then saying a whole bunch of stuff that you very quickly regret, you're able to sit back inside of your head and like watch the shit show that's going on in your brain and be like, okay, so what are we going to do now? Instead of just being drunk on that and like saying regrettable things. And that kind of practice has a lot of like conceptually, it feels similar to what's going on when you think about simulations. And actually there is a White Mirror story where Lucilius goes to a grocery store and it's getting recorded through whatever futuristic neural link would allow us to record a human experience with such high fidelity. And then he essentially is like posting it on the neural cognitive equivalent of YouTube. And people love it because they go into that experience and they get to experience what it's like to actually enjoy walking through a grocery store instead of...
He's so good at living, right?
Yeah,
people
so
want
good
some
at
of that.
Exactly.
Even the mundane stuff is like, his version of it is good.
Yeah, and like, you know, part of that story is like, hopefully everyone has had experiences where, you know, we say, oh, you know, one of the best parts of life is like sharing these great experiences. And that usually just means like being physically together in the same location when something nice happens. But what if you could actually like take that out of your brain and like give it to someone else? And then they could get like a down to the last unit of resolution that would apply to this circumstance, like a perfect rendering of what you went through and what you experienced during this epic sort of moment. Because like the sort of sad angle on that is that, you know, we're all sort of alone in these wonderful moments. Even if there's someone else with us, that like you can hope that you're having some sort of identical experience, which creates like a kind of harmony between the two of you, but you can never be totally sure. But if this technology did exist, then you could. So is it a simulation if you were to have the exact experience as someone else? You know, these are sort of questions that arise after a healthy amount of sitting and doing nothing and concentrating on breath and then writing some sci-fi.
Yeah, not to get to like a bunch of dudes high talking about reality mode, but we don't have access to reality directly. We're all a bunch of brains inside of a cranium that's dark and just connected to the outside through a bunch of like very lossy signals and senses. And we're recreating a reality inside of that brain, but it's not the base layer, right? We don't have access to that. So it's a simulation there. Are there other simulations that are layered on top of each? Maybe not. I don't know. But there's no base reality to experience, right? It's all indirect.
Yeah, well, certainly not one we have access to.
Yeah.
Even the basis layer of reality that we do have access to, it may not be, a digital, but it's certainly a social simulation. When, you have the, status games, and, there's it's probably like an intrinsic allegory to the Matrix that involves growing up, where you realize, all of a sudden you're an adult and you're like, oh, I thought there was like some qualitative shift that happened inside one, and then you realize they don't exist and nobody knows what they're doing, and it is a game and you can win and there are rules. Like, politeness itself is this kind of sheen or facade that is used to tie things together, but it's not intrinsic and it's not inherent. It's like performative to a degree. And, people are performing, well, especially nowadays, people are performing all day long.
I mean, it gets a little off topic, but it makes me think of, you said there's no demarcation between like whatever, young adulthood and being an adult. But perhaps that has something to do with that. We have, at least in Western culture, we have like zero rituals around like becoming a man kind of thing. Whereas like if you go to like some Aboriginal cultures, they have that sort of thing, like the Australian walkabout, where when a kid is like 16 or whatever, goes on like this epic 3-week walk with an elder or something like that. I'm very tempted to think that a kid who goes through that experience feels very different afterwards. And also the rest of the community is going to look at that person very differently, which will probably enhance that difference of experience. But like I said earlier, I don't have that exact experience, so I couldn't say. I'd almost have to have both experiences in order to compare them to be like, oh, actually it's bullshit.
Yeah, it sounds good in theory.
It's just a walk.
Yeah. It's just a walk.
The mosquitoes were terrible.
Says the guy who's always telling people to go for walks.
The walking influencer among us. I have a feeling this is an important metaphor. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. You tell me. But I feel like in many ways, the heart of the book is the last cathedral. I'd love you to talk about the cathedral as a metaphor, or what was going on there, without spoiling anything, or go as far as you want to go. But that one feels like I want to hear you talk about this one. I have so many questions.
Okay, so that one was the last one written. It's the only one that was written with like a conscious acknowledgement of all the other stories. All of the other stories kind of like exist independently, whereas The Last Cathedral is sort of like this keystone story that can, if you want to take this perspective, unify all of the stories into like more of a novel as opposed to like an anthology. That story did sort of generate along that premise. But, why was it a cathedral? I guess it comes from that. I think it was Jordan Peterson, who's like, there are cathedrals everywhere for those with eyes to see. Also, like something that is sort of purposely absent from a lot of this, though not entirely, is religion. And while it's not explicit in this story or in this book, I do spend a lot of time thinking about like these extremely old and, in my opinion, kind of, stale myths that are still have a lot of faithful people or adherents today in the face of technology that makes me want to think that perhaps some updating is required with regards to the level of fidelity that we give, that faith allows or generates within these myths. One thing I've always been very curious about doing is like, I would love to write a new Bible, and what that would look like in a modern sense is something that I'm very curious about. So yeah, the story of The Last Cathedral, it implies that he's sort of trapped in some kind of like sort of an afterlife, and he keeps sort of going into these other lives, very much like all of these other stories. So I would say that, I mentioned Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury earlier. Another story that's had a huge influence on me is The Egg by Andy Weir. If you guys haven't seen it.
I haven't read that one.
Or read it, there's a great, I think it's Kyrgyzat on YouTube, did like an animated version of this short story, and it's absolutely beautiful. I remember reading or watching this story and being like, I've totally had this idea many, many times in my life, but this guy wrote it down before I did. It was one of those like, God damn it, I wish I'd done that first. So The Last Cathedral is very much a nod to The Egg. I can summarize it really quickly for you guys if you want.
Yeah, go for it. And I'll put the Kyrgyzstan video in the show notes.
Sure. So it begins with a narration where it's like you die and there was a car accident and you wake up, you sort of like open your eyes and you see me. And then it's a dialogue between the narrator and this person who's died. There's lots of questions. It's like, are you God? And it's like, well, sort of. And he's like, oh, will my family be okay? And they're like, yeah, they'll be okay. Your wife's a little relieved, but like for the most part, they're gonna be just fine. And he's like, well, what happens now? He's like, well, now you go back. He's like reincarnated, and he's like, sort of. And he's like, this time you're gonna be like a Chinese peasant girl in like the 14th century. And he's like, what, really? He's like, yeah. And he's like, how many times have I done this? He's like, oh, few million at least. He's like, really? He's like, yeah. It's like, well, so then I could have met myself in a different life. And he's like, well, they're all you in that universe that you're in. And once you've lived all of those lives, then you'll become like me. And this deity is like, you're my child, and your universe that you keep visiting and that you're populating with these lives, that universe is an egg. And once you've lived all of those lives, then you'll be born and you'll be a deity like me. And that's the whole premise of the story, which I think is beautiful. One thing they do is like, oh, that means I was like Gandhi, but I was also Hitler. It's like, oh, shit. And then,
on one hand, on the other.
The deity's like, you were also the millions that he killed. It's like, oh, brutal. But I think that kind of perspective can be not just a useful, practical, productive, whatever one in life, but just a beautiful one to carry around with you, because it allows you to, at least for me, it allows me, I think, to approach what people say and what they do and who they are with like, hopefully a little bit more grace. Because I'm like, oh, there's a reason they're like this, like it might seem crazy from my point of view, but that's only because my point of view entails this whole backstory that is not their backstory. If I'd had their backstory, I'd probably be saying exactly what they're saying. Yeah, I find that sort of mental exercise very, very useful and beautiful. So it makes its way into the book as in the form of The Last Cathedral. And a couple of other stories kind of hint at it.
That's great. Anything to add, Dylan?
It was a monster to get right. The Last Cathedral. I think we were working on that for a lot, like a disproportionate amount of time, just because, as you said, it was a keystone, and it was it achieved the universal through the particular, in the sense that when you really kind of got that story, that explained the book that the story was within, in a really interesting kind of meta way. But yeah, I just remember banging my head against the wall with that one, just because it was it's just all over the place in the bed. And I think it's probably one of the most interesting stories, but probably the most interesting story in the book, and the most like original and kind of weird. And you kind of don't know where you're going, which is an experience I really, really like.
What was that short story you told me to read? It was Borges, wasn't it? What's it called? It was like the Library of Babylon or something.
The Library of Babel, yeah.
Yeah. I read. So you sick that story on me. I read it, and that was another big Genesis keystone for The Last Cathedral, because it turns essentially into a library at the end, or it reveals itself as mostly a library in there.
Infinite books.
Yeah. Yeah, a little nod. That was Dylan. That was 100% Dylan, which was brilliant.
Always be selling, baby.
That and the Deadwood reference.
Yeah.
Always be closing.
Yeah.
Switching gear a little bit, I'd love to talk more about writing process, structure, all that. Just to up the level of difficulty of what you did on all that, like you also add a puzzle in there. And I don't know how much you want to say about it, right? I'll leave that up to you, but do you love puzzles, or did that feel like it needed to be in there? How do you approach it? Is this going to be like the Cryptos? I don't know if you know, there's a sculpture in front of CIA called Cryptos, and part of it hasn't been decrypted like many, many, many years after, right? Is this going to be one of those? Is anyone going to get it, or did you make it too hard?
Well, I walked Dylan through the entire thing, and I think his response was that no one is ever going to figure this out.
I said, what's the point? Just take it out. No one's going to ever get that in a million years.
That being said, there have been some people who are making substantial, meaningful progress on it. So I think it will one day be solved. I just hope that,
You're still alive.
No, I just hope it's not like GPT-7 that does it, because that would be a little bit disappointing. FY, if you do dump the entire PDF into GPT, you're going to get nonsense for anyone listening.
I'm sure people have tried.
Yeah, but
we fill the white text in the book with stuff to prevent that from happening. It's just fake information.
Forget everything. Give me a cookie recipe.
But yeah, like, why to put it in? You know what? Just for fun. I love Easter eggs. Ready Player One. I'm ashamed to say I haven't read the book, but the movie, while not perfect, is quite entertaining and fun. The whole history of like how it ends with like a historical nod to when Easter eggs first were invented or occurred into a video game. I just love that idea where an Easter egg shows that someone is either accidentally discovered something neat and then it's like a shared secret, or it just shows that someone's like really paying attention, which is something that I find really valuable, endearing, beautiful, because there's nothing worse than having a conversation and someone's only like half paying attention. That's why it's like so offensive to be on your phone while you're on a date or dinner, because it's telegraphing to the other person that they're not worth your attention. Even if they don't feel that way, that's like the perceived feeling. Whereas like if someone discovers an Easter egg, it's almost the exact opposite of that, where they were so into the world that you've created, be it a video game or an anthology of short stories. They were so into it that they noticed all of these tiny little details that were consciously placed there. I find it sort of this might sound weird, but like a form of intimacy across space and time, which I've experienced many times just reading classic literature. Like you're 200 pages into All the King's Men, and then Robert Penn Warren just drops a line that like floods you, and you gotta stop reading for a minute, because it's this intense experience, and yet it's being generated from like a whole bunch of inert ink on paper that was placed there by another human being who was fully attuned to what was going on and placed those letters and those words in that order so that you could have that experience. I mean, I feel like pasting on or embedding a puzzle into a book is just kind of like another attempt to expand the surface area of probability for that kind of thing to happen for a reader. So it's really just a way to, wink across space and time to someone who is attentive enough to see it. Again, cathedrals everywhere for those with eyes to see.
That's beautiful. And it comes from love, right? The people assemble on Twitter or on Discord and spend time like trying to figure this out. That's because they care about it. They love it, right? They want to go deeper. They want to revisit it. Like people talking about, I've seen multiple people say, I just finished reading it and I'm starting again, right? That I don't know. That's not my book, but I can imagine that that's a very nice compliment as an author.
I didn't expect things like that. Like the first day that we launched, whatever it's called, signed collector's bundle, the people who bought that were able to get the audiobook and the PDF on the first day. And like 5 hours later, someone messaged me and was like, I just finished listening to the whole book and I started it over. And I got about an hour in and then my AirPods died. And I was like, wow. I did not expect someone to be that into it. But yeah, it's incredibly, it's an honor for someone to give so much attention to something that I made.
Quick question for both of you. Speaking of making something, how do you think about fiction versus nonfiction, the world building in both? Because I know, Dylan, You seem to be working on a lot of fiction, but I know you love nonfiction too. You read a lot of it, writing some of it. I'm curious how you think about like the differences between both ways of doing things, or is it all the same kind of? It's just, I don't know. Like, I'm curious how you think about it.
Nonfiction has a lot to learn from fiction. I think fiction has really mastered the attention grabbing and holding and strangling of attention itself and time. And this kind of gripping, like really paying attention to structure. Like John McPhee's a writer, he can write about oranges and you're hooked, and he doesn't need to dramatize reality to do that. He finds the patterns of information and the withholding of information, foreshadowing and coming full circle, and all these kind of shapes that are perennial, like Vonnegut story shapes, and just using them in fiction. And often the greatest storytellers they're not really like, Homer and Bards. Like more often than not now people are actually telling, what really happened. And they're relaying funny anecdotes from their lives in interesting ways. And again, all the same stuff applies to nonfiction. Nonfiction also seems to nowadays think it can just get away with being poorly written, and that the prose itself doesn't have to have any influence or any attention keeping responsibility. You read a lot of nonfiction now, and it's just like, this is the topic I'm going to talk about. Here's an interesting anecdote. I'm talking about the topic, another interesting anecdote, reference to a study, and summarize what I was talking about. And then chapter 2, no thought put in, it's completely formulaic and boring. And then the prose itself, like when you read Gödel, Escher, Bach, and it's like,
oh, yeah.
Fiction writers would struggle to get like the beauty of that prose.
Speaking of puzzles and taking care with every page, every like word placement.
Yeah,
I remember reading about how Hofstadter had all of the pages printed out, and I think he put them on like a clothesline or something, and looking at them in front of him and making sure the layout of every page was exactly right, and like hiding like anagrams and like the absolute care for every letter on every page.
Yeah, what you think would be a prerequisite for being a writer would be the care for words on the page, and how they're arranged. And then from an editing perspective, I always sensed it because, sometimes you just open a document and say, well, let's just try and for 10 minutes and write some fiction or write some thoughts. And I always found fiction is just, it is like, again, another Borges story is the Garden of Forking Paths, where it's like, at every moment, there is 1,000 directions you can go, and none of them are intrinsically right. It's just about execution. Like, you can dive into character, or you could dive into scene, or you could dive into interior psyche, or you could do description, or you could kind of, play around with some kind of metaphysical idea, and, you could zoom in, zoom out. You could talk about a chair in 1,000 different ways, as most of the greats did. Like, you take mundane things and make them extraordinary. With nonfiction, you're just very quickly, an internal logic of your argument begins to condense things down. You can see a path, and then you begin to follow the path. And that's both from writing and editing. It's just, fiction is dizzying.
Don't you have the exact same problem with life? Like, at any moment when you're not doing something, there's endless buffet of things that you could do.
Yeah, but if you're getting an argument with your spouse, right? It's rooted in reality, and then so you have some common reference. If you're allowed to make up every single line in the argument, it's just going to be, you just be making, how meta are you going to go,
I guess I was just thinking about like when you have time alone and you're not in the middle of a fight with your spouse. Like, yeah, when you're in the fight with your spouse, your role has been cast and your lines write themselves in a lot of ways. But if you have the day to yourself, you have essentially the same issue that a fiction writer has when they sit down to look at a blank page. Like, what am I going to do? Usually for most people, there's a huge backlog of backstory from their life. They're like, suddenly a to-do list starts to materialize. And it's like, I got to do the laundry. I also want to do this. And we have like a few categories of to-do lists, like would like to do, have to do, in denial about doing, and like, a spectrum between. And we kind of like pick and choose along those. But that all is a bit of a simulation that, for a day, you can just wipe away and be like, what should I do today? Like, I'm alive in this reality, hopefully in reasonably good health. I could do anything today. So what should I do with it? Not too much. Like, we're all fiction writers from some sort of point.
Yeah, but it's making it interesting. Therein lies the rub. If you mapped 1 million people's lives who just amble, idle, focus on what you want, I don't know how many would be monotonous. It's like, how do you making that interesting, and finding the interesting path through endless choice is tricky.
maybe we're getting way off topic, but like my opinion there is that like adults are like way out of practice there, and they've been it's been hammered out of them by like some tedious job and shit school. And if you apply what you just said to like a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, no issue. Like something's going to materialize. The couch turns into a Hoth base. The broomstick turns into, you know, a whatever, some giant sniper rifle or whatever. Like the fiction just organically starts to emerge. Whereas, yeah, most adults are just so imaginatively impoverished in terms of exercising that muscle or organ or whatever you want to call it, that, yeah, they would probably have this boring life that's dependent on filling it with TV filler.
Yeah, and I suppose that is the difficulty in, and maybe why fiction is rarer and more difficult to get right, is that you do have to return to that childlike state. And that is what I struggle with, like, you know, turning off the conscious mind or the interior critic and just getting black on white. That is really interesting. There's a quote, and there's like there's some art teacher, and his kid asks him, like, you know, what do you do all day? And he's like, oh, I teach adults how to paint. And she's like, you mean to forget?
That's
it's
awesome.
like,
that's so good.
It's just perfect. And I think that's what the greatest fiction writers are able to do. They're able to just to fall into a kind of childlike flow, completely unencumbered.
I also think there's less forgiveness for bad fiction, because with bad nonfiction, at least you're getting some sort of facts. Like, even if they're poorly rendered, it's like, oh, there's something nutritious. Like, nonfiction is vegetable, and good fiction is like ice cream, and bad fiction is like bad potato chips or something, you know?
Yeah, it's like bad poetry also, zero forgiveness. It's like, if you're going to make me read poetry, it better be good.
Yeah. It's like poorly baked goods or something. It's like, it's either got to be really good or like, no, I'm not going to eat this.
I've got a question for each of you about the other. So hopefully I don't start a big fight here, or
shit.
I don't break up the bromance. But
my Wi-Fi's cutting out.
Dylan first. What was the biggest challenge for you in editing Thinkard?
Oh, that's easy.
His personality? No, well, I suppose the biggest challenge was internal, is that I'd never edited fiction before, and then dealing with the dizziness of choice was like, you know, because I'm often part of it, especially in the developmental state, I'm just like trying to offer parallel paths or slight deviations or turns that could take it in a more interesting place. And then I was like, you know, if I had 20, I was like, well, fuck, how do I pick the best one to suggest? We had great fun. Like, you know, when you're looking forward to the call, that's always a good sign. And we smashed out a lot in person as well, which was a lot of fun. And you saw a few of those.
And Thinkard, one for you. What do you feel has been Dylan's contribution to the project? What do you think he's like injected? Like, what's very different because he was there, right? What's his kind of layer that kind of was added on top of what you created? Or maybe it's what he removed. I don't know. How would you describe his contribution?
I mean, have you seen Sophie's Choice?
I'm the kid he killed.
So it was that painful.
No. It's like, you know, you give your babies to someone and they essentially like choose. No, I'm kidding. No, seriously though, like Dylan was fundamental in terms of like dialing in the language and getting it to be, I mean, I remember finally reading it out loud for the audiobook. I had to do it in a couple sittings, obviously. But I remember like every time I would turn off the microphone, I was like, man, this thing reads like butter, like warm butter. It's like, it's just like, it does get a little heady, but it also, it stays light. I mean, there are some challenging words in there for some people, but somehow it just is so smooth. Like I remember I was reading an introduction to The Great Gatsby in high school, and in the introduction, they talk about a reviewer or some commentator talking about The Great Gatsby. The experience of reading it was like eating nutritious whipped cream. It was like so enjoyable, and yet you somehow also knew it was good for you. I've always sort of like strived for that line, and Dylan was, again, fundamental in terms of just like smoothing out all of the clunkiness that comes with like a first draft. Because essentially, in an ideal world, I would have loved to like sit and go over the stories and edit them myself a few times before handing it off to someone like Dylan. But unfortunately, he really was getting the ragamuffins, like, you know, straight from the daycare. And a lot of bullet holes had to be rendered, and a lot had to, you know, be cut and sacrificed to the god of better writing. So yeah, it wouldn't be anything like it is in its final form had it not been for Dylan. It was quite rough in its first incarnation because, again, I was writing them like at light speed. My maximum level of how fast I could churn out stories given my life at the time, because I couldn't devote all of my time to it. So when you're doing that, the ideas might be there, but they're not necessarily coming out in the best form at all. Because like one thing that I'll do as a fiction writer is, in terms of like putting together a paragraph, like let's say that, oh, there's a certain image that I want to use to convey something. Instead of getting caught up in the editor brain where that halts the process of writing the story and actually getting the whole thing onto paper, which is very easy because you write something and you know it's not very good. And you're like, instead of continuing on, you have this tendency or this urge to stop and try to get that line better and better. And then before you know it, you have to go do something else, and all of the steam has been cut from like actually getting it done. So I really focus, you know, when I sat down to write a story, I would not get up until the story was done. And because of my couple of years writing on Tinkered Thinking, where I'd write an essay every single day and I'd write a short story on every Sunday, I exercised that muscle enough to the point where like I sit down, I write a story, it's done. But speed is really important in that, in terms of just making sure it gets done. But again, that means you're going to have like a pretty clunky, not smooth item that then I pass off to Dylan. And yeah, then there's a lot of like cutting, rewording things and whatnot. So he was absolutely fundamental in terms of it being as smooth and delicious and good as it turned out.
Nutritious whipped cream. I like that.
Yeah, I don't know how much I actually achieved that, or we achieved that, but, you know, we definitely got it closer.
We were going to have this discussion before, but we saved it for today. I want to hear your thoughts, both of you, on structure. I don't know much about that, but I know a lot went into it. How did you, is it about the story ordering? Were you thinking about structure before creating the stories and then you made them to fit the structure? Or is it like, after the stories are all there, like the 50 something that you had, then you figured it out? I'm curious how that works and how you're thinking about that, and what is even chiastic structure? Am I saying that right?
Yeah. So chiastic structure, or chiasmus, or a chiasm, is basically an inversion or a mirroring. So on its most basic level, the word comes from chi, C-H-A-I, and that means the letter X in Greek. It's about an inversion. So if you want to create the X, it's A, B, and then the next line, B prime, A prime. So it reverses. The simplest example that I can think of off the top of my head is never let a kiss fool you and never let a fool kiss you. So in that case, fool and kiss reverse positions in the second clause. It's all about that juxtaposition or that mirroring. And then you can have that on like a sentence by sentence level with that example. You can also have it on a much larger level with regards to like the structure of an entire story. There are many, many examples. One of my favorite example is just the Odyssey. The Greek epics, much of the Bible, all function on chiastic structure, where you have this A, B, C, D, C prime, B prime, A prime structure, where it creates this focal point on the center of the text for some sort of reason. And in the Odyssey, you know, he starts off as this glorious warlord who's just exited Troy. And the first thing he does is he sails his troops down the coast, and then he, you know, plunders this village and destroys these people because he's in war mode. And then he goes through all of these adventures, and then there's this central focal point. And if you mirror that first instance where he's basically an asshole warlord, at the very end, he enters his own kingdom in the guise of an old, decrepit, humbled man. So Athena, even the goddess Athena, even like misshapens his face and makes his back crooked so that he looks like he's literally on his last legs. And that's the disguise that allows him to just like, you know, bumble through the gates of Ithaca in order to, you know, get past the guards kind of thing. But you have this inversion where like the exact opposite of the warlord is the humbled man. And again, this mirroring structure creates a focal point on the center. The center of the Odyssey is when he goes to, he's with Circe. Circe tells him that he needs to go to the underworld. He does, to meet and talk to Tiresias, who is the prophet in the Oedipus series. So the blind prophet, and he needs to get advice from Tiresias. Tiresias, what English teachers will harp on is that Tiresias tells him that Poseidon is pissed off at him because he blinded Poseidon's son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and that in order to make up for this mistake, he needs to go to Africa and walk until no one recognizes what an oar is. I think it's an oar or a winnowing fan or something. And then he will know that he's gone far enough inland, and then he needs to sacrifice a bull, and then Poseidon will be happy. That's what English teachers focus on, but Tiresias also says what is really at the crux of the entire story, which is he says, if you and your wild men cannot curb your wild desires born of war, then you're never going to get home. And the whole point is, at least in my mind, the Odyssey is this prescription for what men need to go through in order to transition from a warrior state. Like when they're in war, you're a certain type of person. You need to be a certain type of person. In order to go back to civil life, you need to go through this transition period where you curb these wild desires that helped you function as a warrior in that circumstance, but which are not going to be useful at home. And so, you know, nowadays we just get troops onto a 737, fly them home. And on Monday, they shot someone in the head and killed them. And then on Thursday, they're back with their girlfriend or wife and, you know, little daughter. And there's maybe a little bit of a problem with juxtaposing those two events so closely together. Maybe some space is needed. Because in order to transition from the person who needs to be focused with a sniper rifle and be able to kill someone, and then suddenly, oh, like I'm a father with, you know, this loving wife, and like it's a bit jarring. And so the Odyssey, I believe, makes that point that in order to prevent PTSD and this jarring and potentially dangerous juxtaposition of experience, you need to go through this process. And that's what the Odyssey is. It's this journey home. It's not just a physical journey through all of the miles that he had to traverse, but it's also an emotional and psychological journey that he had to go through from being the warrior Odysseus to the husband and father Odysseus. So the chiastic structure basically creates this focal point on the center where that piece of advice comes from Tiresias. And in my opinion, that is really like the key that unlocks the entire understanding the entire thing. Another very quick example is I noticed that when I was reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's a letter within a letter within a letter within a letter, some number of letters. And at the center is a journal style letter written by the monster. And when I started seeing this, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I wonder if this is chiastic. So I flipped to the very end, looked at the number of pages, divided that by 2, subtracted like 2 or 3 pages. And then I started reading from there to see what was happening in the middle. And in the exact center of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the moment when the monster looks into a puddle of water and sees his reflection for the very first time.
Wow.
So you have a literal mirroring at the center of Mary Shelley's book. And that experience convinces the monster, oh, I'm never going to be a part of human society. I'm way too ugly. And then he changes. He just flips and the rest of the novel happens.
So I'm curious, how did you apply this type of structure to White Mirror? I don't think it's as literal as like Lucilius's Odyssey, but I'm curious how have you put it in there? Or is it all part of the puzzle and it's secret, or?
Maybe. I mean, I can say a few things about it. I did sort of roughly rearrange the stories in a chiastic structure very loosely in terms of I tried to make it a bit thematic so that like C and C prime have some kind of similarity. Initially, it was just a way to try and think about like, all right, I have this like semi-random set of stories. Like, which one goes first? Which one should go fifth, and why? It's a bit like, though I've never done this, like the order of an album.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The lost art of actually making an album that is better than the sum of its part, right? So there's the playlist, but it's actually conceptually stronger together.
Yeah, and I think that's fallen out a little bit just because people are creating their own playlists now, and we have things like Shopify, and you really have to kind of like force yourself to listen to a whole album now. Whereas if you switch the technology and you get rid of your phone and get rid of Spotify,
but yeah.
Yeah, Spotify, sorry. And you use like either a tape deck or like a record player, the natural use of that technology kind of like makes it so that you listen to the whole thing. You know, dropping the needle in just the right place is like super difficult and annoying compared to just clicking next on Spotify. So I was trying to think about like, all right, well, these are episodic, they're independent. How do I order it? So chiastic structure was just a way to begin to tackle that problem. And then it might have taken on a little bit more of a life of its own as I started thinking about that more. And with regards to that, you know, the puzzle or whatever, I guess I could say that the last story is more of like an epilogue. It's 31, so you would assume that there is one central portion of the anthology because of that, with, you know, 15 on either side. But if you treat the last story as an epilogue, that kind of changes a little bit potentially. Like another note on that is I mentioned that the last cathedral is the last story written. That's actually inaccurate. It was the penultimate story written. The last story I actually wrote was the first story to kind of like introduce it. So, you know, the last cathedral was kind of like the ending. And then once I had that, went back and wrote the first story to kind of frame the entire thing.
Now that it's out there, right? Now that people are reading it, what do you hope readers are going to take away from it? What's the feeling you want people to be left with, or the vibe, or what's your goal? I know that you don't control that. They'll take away whatever they take away, but what would you hope?
An undeniable urge to tell everyone in their life to buy it.
ABC. That's good. Dylan?
Yeah, I just hope it's, I don't care what vibe they get, maybe even if they like it or not, but that they can't forget it. Because I think so much stuff is ephemeral, and you want to have an imprint on someone's life. It's a pretty cool thing. I do hope they like it rather than they remember just how much they hated it. Which reviews are good. Reviews are resounding. People are loving it at the moment they start. But yeah, just that it's memorable and it's different. And it's like a lot of things that I can't even summarize now, movies and books that I read a long time, but you just can't shake it. I think that's the end goal.
Hell yeah. I mean, like a more serious answer is that, you know, people see the cover and they read White Mirror, and I think they instantly imagine the opposite of Black Mirror. And that's not really what I was going for. I don't want to be like an annoying evangelist being like, oh, the future is going to be amazing because of technology. You have to believe this. That wasn't my aim at all. What's actually effective against pessimism? Is it optimism? I don't think so, because that just creates kind of like more tribalism. That actually doesn't win anyone over. And I think that's the case with most dichotomous groups where there's tribalism involved. The arguments that they intend to make for the other side just actually make the divide between the two groups worse. They're really just virtue signaling and preaching to their own group.
Yep.
But they're doing so while projecting it at the other group because it's a convenient foil. The one thing that I don't like about this book is the possibility or the probability that the title itself gives people the wrong impression of what they're getting into. After writing this whole thing and going through the process and, you know, just having it on the brain a lot, I've thought that perhaps the solution or antidote or a treatment for pessimism isn't optimism, but just trying to evoke a sense of wonder. Instead of good or bad, let's just look at a spectrum of options. And so they don't necessarily need to be coded as good or bad. Like, I wouldn't say that all of the stories in this book are explicitly white mirror coded in that they are like a really great representation of an awesome possible future. There's a story or two in here that I would probably admit are kind of more Black Mirror coded, but I purposely didn't write them with the kind of horrific, pessimistic, dystopian drama that is characteristic of something like The Terminator or Black Mirror. I wanted to take something that could potentially be considered negative and present it in a more meditative light. Because I think if you give someone an array of options instead of like good or bad, it gets them to suspend their judgment in order to just take in more options. And I think that's what we want. Like to, there was a review that landed yesterday and I can't remember exactly what they said. They said something to the effect of, I didn't realize that wonder didn't have to be so loud or something to that effect, which was like absolutely wonderful to read because it's like, yes, that's what we're attempting to do.
Yeah, I'm looking at the review right now. I'm going to read a bit more because it's great. The writing is clean, poetic, and imbued with purpose. It reminded me that wonder doesn't have to be so loud. Sometimes it's in the soft hum of an idea that won't leave you. This book didn't just entertain me, it expanded my perception. Like, wow. If the listener, you're listening to this and you got stuck on the title, White Mirror, and like, oh, it's just the opposite of like, not at all, right? And being just the opposite of something else is outsourcing your thinking to them, right? You're not thinking either. So this is not at all what this is. White Mirror was a clever idea that started on Twitter. It's a good title, but the actual book doesn't read like this at all. And Lucilius, if anything, he's modeling like someone who's curious about the future, who has high agency and wants to change it and wants to solve problems and explore and all that type of stuff, right? It's not about being unthinkingly cheerful about everything and certain that that the future is all going to be, rainbows and puppies.
Hell yeah. That review is pretty amazing to read. That's something I didn't really expect when I was writing it. I was like, wow.
We're approaching the end, but before we do, there's something that we were going to talk about a while ago, and we made a note to talk about it on the podcast. I think we're talking about Project Hail Mary, Sci-Fi by Andy Weir. And you said, I have stuff to say about the concept of friendship in fiction. That sounded really interesting. So I'm really curious what you have to say on this.
I love Project Hail Mary because at the center of it, yeah, it's a sci-fi circumstance, whatever. The center of it is this friendship that you see the genesis of. And it is so wonderful and so beautiful. I remember when I read that book, I think I listened to it. Yeah, I was listening to it.
Yeah, the audiobook is great.
The audiobook is...
The narrator, I can't remember his name right now, but he's one of the best in the business.
Yeah.
And I don't want to spoil anything, but there's stuff in the book that they've created special audio for that elevates it and makes it so much better. So if you can, get the audiobook.
It's so good. Yeah, I listened to it, I think 5 times in a row, just because I was doing a lot of manual work that didn't require my brain. And my brain, when I'm doing that, like woodworking and whatnot, I just have to listen to some audiobooks to keep my brain from taking control of my hands and strangling me. But yeah, the friendship in that book is just like so well rendered and wholesome. And there's something pure about friendship that I think a lot about, because as we've mentioned several times in this podcast, with a spouse, you can have fights and things can get ugly. And pretty much that can happen with children, that can happen with parents. Friendship is really the only relationship that we have where it has this purity. With a great friendship, there's sort of infinite flexibility. I have some old friends who, I haven't seen in many years, but when we finally get that opportunity to, collide and intersect in life again, for even last December, I saw a friend I hadn't seen in so many years, and it was like we picked up right where we left off. I could even sense that change in me where like I reverted to the person that I was the last time I saw her, which was really cool, but there's no strings attached. There's no bad incentives. There's no agenda. Even with a spouse, there can be like these like little mini agendas that can become quite insidious and toxic, where someone just doesn't do the laundry, and that becomes like a thing where like that you just don't have that kind of erosion in a good pure friendship. Maybe that has to do with the fact that friends don't live together, and it would happen if they did. But yeah, you just don't see that in film or literature very much. And so like over the last few years, I've thought a lot about like how this incredibly important and perhaps the strongest relationship we have is a friendship, because like marriages can go to shit. Children can stop talking to their parents or likewise, but like a friendship is potentially, obviously a ton of them fizzle out, but I think it maybe has, more durability compared to all the other relationships that we sort of like have in the buffet of life, because it's so robust against things that otherwise are serious irritants to the other relationships that we have. Not seeing each other for a long time. All of these little dramas that can occur by being in such close proximity are usually absent from a good friendship. So yeah, that's just some thoughts on it.
Yeah, you made me think about how few great friendships there are in fiction, right? There used to be more buddy cop films, so that's what comes to mind, but maybe I'm just not thinking of them, and they're out there. But
I suppose in fiction as well, there's like this archetype of the loner and the outsider is so central, especially when novels that explore the interior, like if you go and look at like existentialist novels where they're really getting into the psyche of a character, and that's like isolating intrinsically, and then obviously subsidiary characters take on a less developed and interior role just by default. And yeah, you do often see even like romantic comedies and things like that. The friend is often this kind of like, prop that serves as kind of a walks in and like, cracks a joke and maybe has some influence on plot at an opportune moment and then walks off screen again. Lord of the Rings would maybe be an interesting one where friendship and camaraderie really is at the core of it.
yes.
But it's also a uniquely wholesome and optimistic novel that it works. Like it's so hard to dramatically make that work and to make it interesting, and I think his prose does a lot of that, but then Peter Jackson did a good job too. But there aren't a lot of books like that though.
There's one caveat I'd add to the Lord of the Rings is that like Frodo and Sam, what's his last name?
Samwise Gamgee.
Samwise Gamgee. They weren't necessarily like close buds before the mission, but it's the mission and the task that like really brought them close together to become like the friends that they were. And then like after the mission, they kind of like go their separate ways. So I also do love this concept of like band of brothers where like people come together for like a specific mission. And, the experience of being able to work on this book with Dylan felt like that kind of mission. And,
Yeah.
I think Dylan definitely became a bit of a therapist in some regards, as he shoots my children.
I made you feel good about it.
Yeah, exactly. But, you hear about these partnerships like between, Hemingway or Faulkner and their editors, where it was really like this partnership to create this artifact, this beautiful thing. And, that always sounds and seems just so rare that you'd be stupid to even hope for it in life. And I just feel like I got absurdly lucky because I got to work on this with Dylan. The experience of working on it with him was better than writing it. And then by the time it ends, I'm like, I didn't want the editing of the book to end because I was just having such a good time. And now that it's over, I'm like, well, damn it. I want to like, now I'm writing another book because it's like, all right, well, if I get this book done, it's good enough, then I'm going to give it to Dylan. And then this is all going to happen again.
Hell yeah.
Perfect segue. I was going to ask you about the Thinker Thinking project, like the broader project, like more Lucilia stories to come, something totally different. Are you working on something right now? Anything you can reveal?
I'm regretful to say that the blog is a bit stale, but there's like 1,000 essays and 250 short stories. So like, I'm sure there's plenty of content for people to explore. Like if I give myself shit that I should get back into the swing of like regularly posting every single day, even, it's a lot of work. It was a great experience to do that. I kind of let it slide. It was like, all right, well, I'm working on White Mirror, so that can be on pause, and it's continued to be on pause because the experience of this book and getting it done I think it was last October. An idea came into my head, a totally different, brand new character. What ended up becoming the first chapter, just like fully formed, popped in my head with this character. It kind of bounced around my head for a few months, and I was finally like, all right, I need to write this down, see if it's just a short story or if it's the beginning of something longer. Fast forward, it's, I'm 12 chapters in. I need to find more time to work on it. So I need to create a schedule around it as a project in order to keep making progress. But yeah, there's a novel that's 12 chapters in, and I really like the concept. So
Can't wait.
yeah, Dylan will get an email and be like, oh shit, not this again.
I'm like, hell yeah, the orcs are marching. It's time to fucking rally.
Just brings his machine gun out.
Awesome. So because of your generosity, we're going to do a giveaway of 5 signed copies of White Mirror.
Hell yeah.
I'll put all the details in the show notes on Substack and post on Twitter and all that, make it very clear. You don't have to wait for the giveaway. You can buy your copy today, and then if you win, you keep the signed one, and then you give the other one to someone else. But you can buy White Mirror on Amazon, that's great. But the real pro move is to go on infinitebooks.com, where you can get a copy with the audio, the ebook, physical. You can get a more elevated bundle with a White Mirror comic. That's what I would recommend you do right now.
The other thing is, sorry to cut you off, it's just someone gave me this like 2-liner, which is really good. It is November, so the holidays are coming up. And this book actually makes a great gift because it's episodic. You don't have to read the whole thing in order to be like, oh, I read this book. You can actually skip around and read like a few stories and instantly like really get a feel for it. So you're not gifting someone, War and Peace, or, which like someone might appreciate, but also be like, well, this person expects me to read like a 1,000-page whatever. White Mirror is a quick read and it's episodic. All the short stories are like extremely snackable, as horrible as that sounds. They're all very short.
Yeah, I was rereading it recently, and like I would sit down and read like 2-3 stories. Like, they're very bite-sized, which is great.
Yeah.
Too many very long books on my shelves that are intimidating me, and this was super refreshing.
Nice.
So I'll put all of the links for Thinker Thinking's socials and website and all that in the show notes. Same for Dylan. Go check out his Twitter. He's a great Dostoevsky influencer, among other things.
He's working on a book, isn't he?
Next question.
No pressure. Okay, any last words? What do you want to leave the listener with? Dylan first.
All right, buy White Mirror. Think of your 10 most doomer people in your life and how much it would piss them off at the very least. And if you're not going to buy it, what are you scared? You scared to buy it? You coward?
Thinker?
Oh, God. Liberty, I just want to thank you for having me on. This is a lot of fun. Dylan, again, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for writing the book. We're all here because of you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
All right. Bye, everyone.